areas using specific techniques. Here the artist invents him herself, or we believe he invents him herself. Here the production methods and their historical development become apparent. Since the 1960s, the classical concept of the studio has been increasingly called in question. Alan Capro wrote in his text, How to Make a Happening in 1966, I quote, "The romance of the atelier, like the gallery and museum, will probably disappear in time. But meanwhile, the rest of the world has become endlessly available." End quote. And Daniel Buren claimed in his text the function of the studio in 1972, the abolition of the studio. He proclaimed that he lived and worked in situ because his work was totally site-specific, only made for a specific space, geographically and institutionally. The artwork is destroyed when it's removed from this specific site. A lot has happened since then, the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s. If you think of the developments of public art, installation, performance, interventions, etc. They are all in one way or the other independent from working in the so-called classical studio space. The studio today can be a sort of classical sculptures or painter studio, as we will perhaps see tonight with Katharina Grosse's artist house, but also the computer memory, a shared office space, the street, the city, the exhibition, or a cafe. Currently, the subject seems to be of great relevance, as some recent publications show. Many of them you will see outside, and there is also a book stand of the Galerie Robertus Buchhandlung I want to thank, and you can buy many books, interesting books on the topic there tonight. A few weeks ago, Jens Hoffmann publication, The Studio, with MIT Press and Whitechapel Gallery appeared, and in 2010 it was Michael Diaz and Monika Wagner's Topos Atelier, or in the same year Mary Jane Jacob and Michelle Graeber, The Studio Reader, and 1 year earlier Walter Davids and Kim Pace, The Fall of the Studio Artists at Work. Two of these editors, Jens Hoffmann and Walter Davids, will also be here for lectures within the next weeks. 5 evening sessions deal with different sets of topics, each with 2 or 4 lectures, followed by a discussion where you also, as the audience, can participate. The lecturers are art historians, curators, and artists from all over the world with very different backgrounds. Tonight we have the topic of history and current relevancy of the studio, and next Wednesday, July 25th, there will be The City is Our Factory with Christoph Schäfer and others participating. In 1 week exactly, July 27th, there is political interventions and working in collectives with Tanja Bulgara and others. And on August 6th, very probably many of you won't be here anymore, there's the Global Local Studio, and on August 21st, Getting Out of the Traditional Studio. I want to thank my colleague Bärbel Hartje, who organized and also did the content, who organized the whole event for doing this, and she also, we did the program together, the concept and the selection of the lecturers. So the first section tonight is devoted to the, as I said, the history and current relevancy of the studio as a subject. Art historian and curator Jon Wood will trace the historical development of the studio, its design and operation, using photographs of studios since the 19th century, particularly of sculpture studios. Artist Katharina Grosse, who lives in Berlin, has frequently dealt in different ways with the subject of the studio and the dovetailing of living and working space. In 2007, she had a studio machine built in the district of Moabit by Augustinundfrank architects, consisting of 2 workrooms, a storeroom, an office, living quarters, and several side rooms. We will have now the 2 lectures, which will last approximately 30 minutes each, and subsequently the panel discussion where you are invited to participate. I want to present to you now Jon Wood. He's an art historian and curator who specializes in 20th century and contemporary sculpture, with in particular an ongoing research interest in the artist studio. In these 4 publications I mentioned, he has 3 different articles in 3 different publications. He's really one of the experts of the history of the artist studio. He's research curator at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, where he coordinates the academic research program and creates exhibition. Recent publications include United Enemies, the problem of sculpture in Britain in the 1960s and 70s, last year, and Articulate Objects, Voice, Sculpture and Performance with Oral Satz in 2009, and Close Encounters, the sculpture studio in the Age of Camera in 2001, and this is also his main part of his lecture tonight. I'm very happy you are here. Also, Katharina Grosse, I will present before your talk. Please welcome with me to Jon Wood.
I'd like to thank Hildegund for inviting me to talk this evening about the artist studio, and also to Verbal for her assistance in getting here, and of course to Robert and Frank for the translation work. It's kind of ongoing, I think. It's a commonplace that privileged access to artistic process proves informative, revelatory even, to the viewer, the observer. We might, for example, find privileged access to artistic inspiration, artistic thought in artist writings, in the explanations contained in the recorded interview, or in film footage of artists at work. All of these modes of explanation and representation are, of course, just other kinds of evidence, but all could be seen as giving us primary access to artists' intentions, and thus clues for us to work with when encountering the actual work of art. The indoor realm of the artist studio is a place and a space, and in turn an art theoretical topos at the very heart of this curiosity. The studio has frequently been understood and evoked as the physical surrogate of the artist's mind, and has become so on and off, and increasingly for the last 150 years or so, from Courbet through to now, to mention a more well-known recent example. It is perceived time and time again as a site of original, unique and authentic artistic endeavour. And visiting an artist studio, it's often felt, enables a behind-the-scenes, experiential insight into the artist and his or her work in its correct, originary context, prior to the post-studio spaces of the gallery or the museum. Studios are thus not only scenes of the sites of production for art, but can also give us a primary background to artists and their work. All of this mythology, all of this is fine, but only relatively small proportion of people actually visit artist studios. For the most part, the studio is known, looked at, and thought about through its two-dimensional image. In this way, it's a studio photograph, as well as film, since the 1960s, that has been key in transmitting an image and identity for the studio. Perhaps because the studio photograph is what 99% of us always ever got, and perhaps ever will get to see, well circulated in art magazines, books, and exhibition catalogues. Studio photography, because of this, has enabled both the studio's supporters and its enemies to marshal their arguments, whether it was in the 19th century or in the early 20th. Whether it was Daniel Buren's 1971 celebration of Impasse Ronsard through Brancusi's own photography, or Alan Capro's fascination with the potential dissolution of the studio through Mammoth's photographs at Pollock's studio. In this way, the idea of a studio has always been primarily transmitted and mediated by studio photography. And this has been the case since the late 19th century when photography was invented, but continues into the present. the complicated relationship between the studio and the photograph, between a space and a place, and how it has been variously represented as image and as text, has been central to my work as an art historian and as a curator for a number of years now. And this evening I'd like to take the opportunity to share with you a brief, perhaps idiosyncratic, visual history of the sculptor's studio, pinpointing some of the important themes and tropes, mostly visual, but some of the literary orientation, that have emerged prominently across the last 100 years or so. Often these are themes and issues that do not always readily emerge in the textual and historical accounts of the studio. Sculpture as a three-dimensional art form is crucial here, and for me it's through sculpture that the key issues and ramifications of the studio emerge with a vengeance. The studio, for example, as a place and a space to make and display work. The studio as a stage for artistic self-presentation, carried out in close dialogue with work and with working space. I've chosen to approach this visual history through the lens of an exhibition that I curated a couple of years ago called Close Encounters, the Sculptor's Studio in the Age of the Camera. In doing so, I want to highlight not only some of the main ideas that have circulated about the studio through its visual photographic representation, but also, at the end of this talk, open up a discussion through the example of Brancusi of the display and exhibition of the studio, and ask questions about how photography might in fact continue in interesting ways to mediate the studio's physical presentation today. This exhibition, staged at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, looked at the classic individual artist studio as envisioned through photography. It looked at the studio from the late 19th century to the mid-1960s, focusing on studios of both well-known and lesser-known sculptors active in Britain and France across these years. The Henry Moore Institute's archive is particularly rich in photographs of British sculptors' studios, and this exhibition drew upon this resource while supplementing the display with loans from other public and private archives and collections. Room 1 contained about 60 framed studio photographs, so showing about 35 different sculptor studios. Room 2, as you can see below here, was based on Brassai's extraordinary series of studio photographs, well known to many of you I'm sure, that was reproduced in 1933 in the Surrealist magazine Minotaur, straight after Maurice Reynal's article Je table buvette, gold table basin bowl. In line with this 1933 photo essay, sculptures by Brancusi, Giacometti, Lipchitz, Laurens, Despio and Lyell were placed in front of large-scale versions of the Brassai studio photographs in which these same works actually appear. Looking back at this exhibition, there were three key issues that raised themselves that I'd like to briefly articulate before looking in more detail at the photographs that were shown and the narratives that they opened up. First, the problem of Pygmalianism. For the mid to late 19th century, the representation of the sculptor's studio painting was orientated for the most part around the theme of the artist and model and its mythical counterpart, Pygmalion and Galatea. Whether in the paintings of Danton, where the realities of sculptural labour are foregrounded, or in Giraud's canvases, where the division between the modern sculptor and mythical character are played out, the idea of the studio and workshop as a venue for transformation from flesh to stone, through perception, measurement, hard work, from stone to flesh through conception, reverie and prayer, these are the myths, constituted the popular and particular narrative of the sculptor's studio. This heritage is both absorbed by and reacted to in the examples of the studio photographs that we displayed in the show. As we go through some of these archival photographs, we find that the popular Pygmalion trope or narrative finds itself gradually dismantled and displaced with more other, some visual, less literary conceits. Instead of classical mythology, we find narratives that articulate the connections between the camera and the chisel, between the process of photography and sculpture making, between monochrome photography and sculpture materials, between figuration, artistic performance, and installation or self-portraiture. all of which give us a more complicated, varied and visually subtle conception of the studio than is usually written about. The second issue was the problem of the ubiquitous artist in the studio genre photograph. The image of the artist, seated or standing in his or her studio, posing for the camera, at work or beside work, was and still often is one of the most widespread types of self-promotional studio photograph. The kind of image we might find prefacing a monograph or a catalogue raisonné to give the reader a sense of what the artist looked like at work. The studio in such photographs becomes rather meaningless, serving to denote the workshop background, rather than standing for the practice, and rather than functioning as a dynamic component of the studio, of the photograph studio narrative. The exhibition that we put together aimed at putting this kind of biographical image in context, so that its contribution to the history of the studio photograph could be better viewed and assessed. The third issue that we wanted to deal with was the image of the studio that had already been acquired in this period, and try and complicate its story and narrative through photography. Although some images of studios are more widely circulated than others, there is never, of course, just one studio. And because the studio photograph is the access that most viewers get to the artist's studio, exposure to a much wider or unusual range of studio photography might help unsettle and complicate preconceptions about the studio. It might help complicate the myths of the studio being an ivory tower, or as being a strictly private place removed from elsewhere. In the first room of the exhibition, a form of studio visit was enacted, or reenacted. The photographs in this first room were all organised through this changing focus from close-up to panorama. This movement from the smaller to the larger view has echoes, of course, in the film, panning in and panning out. And this was indeed the plan, offering a moving set of images presented before a moving viewer. The idea here, through this arrangement, was to evoke a kind of studio visit, or rather journey around a number of studios, in which the point of view of the gallery visitors was implicitly and poetically allied to that of studio visitors, so that the idea of the studio gradually opened out as they went along through the gallery. As the visitors moved around the room, groups can be seen to emerge, and comparisons between often unconnected sculptors and studios were there to be made. The closeness between the sculptor and sculpture was to be observed in the first photographs on display, in the close-ups of Henry Moore's hands and on the figures of Rodin and Bourdelle. These photographs, in which the studio environment is barely discernible at all, not only show the sculptor literally in touch with his work, but also present a kind of equivalence between object and maker, through which the sculptor is himself cast as a sculpture in the way that he embraces and encloses it. It's with the hand of the sculptor that this exhibition began, a subject that introduced a wide range of studio and sculptural concerns, from authorship to authenticity, labour and tactility. When looking at the close-up photograph of Henry Moore's hands holding a sculpture, it's easy to imagine ourselves perhaps as a photographer, Thea Struve in this instance, camera in hand, focusing on and framing this detail. And as we moved around the room looking at these photographs, we gradually stepped back to see more of the sculptor and the studio. In between close-up and panorama, we encounter a range of moments that provide a chronology of sculpture making. The sculpture with model and sculpture, the sculpture at work, the sculpture at rest mid-work, and then with work completed. If there are dramas to be noted in all of these set pieces, they are often confirmed in part by the photographs themselves, which all mark, record, or interpret an event or an important occasion. It's here that there is a collision captured by photography between the image and the pragmatics of its daily life and routines. In the studio photographs of Dobson and Epstein, I'm showing you here, the event is the occasion of the portrait, and it's the likeness that charges these images. Moving back and forth between sculptor, sitter, and sculpture, much I think is communicated in these photographs. It's now the sitter who is to become a sculpture, an experience which requires, as just you can see, discipline and good humour. These images also remind us that the portrait is not just a testimony to the art of the sculptor, but also in a sense a collaborative endeavour, in which the sitter makes choices, strikes poses, and plays a part, as a kind of participant observer in his or her own portrayal. When there is no sitter present, and the sculptor is depicted beside the finished work, the image is sometimes a very strange or awkward one. The sculpture often appears trophy-like relative to the sculpture's position in relation to the work, whether standing or sitting in front of, to the side or behind the finished piece. The photograph of Henry Moore standing between his reclining figure and mask, I think, is a particularly interesting example of this. Moore's body is seen from the waist up, behind the work, and his protective posture in between the horizontal figure and the head on the wall behind seems to make him appear sculpture-like, his body part of the reclining figure and his face a mask. If there is a narrative detectable in this image, it seems to me to be one that articulates an inversion of the traditional Pygmalion motif. For here it's the sculptor himself in his photograph who seems to become a sculpture by virtue of his posed relation to the carved objects. In images of the sculpture at work, the studio as a site of action and activity is most powerfully conveyed. Sculpture, on the whole, is of course a messy business, and it's interesting to note the extent to which these photographs show this, and in turn the clothing that the sculptors are shown wearing to carry out their work. The dress code selected is very important and contributes towards the particular kind of artistic identity portrayed in these photographs, whether it be the craftsman or the gentleman artist or the intellectual or the worker. The clothes help emphasise the kind of sculptural practice and studio we are presented with, whilst Gilbert's refined look on the left seems to echo the delicate nature of his craftsmanship. Fullard's impromptu newspaper hat on the right emphasises the vintage, the humorous character of his work. The artist that comes across in the case of Jagger on the left is almost pirate-like, parrot on shoulder and carving apparatus in hand. I also want to place a quiet joke here performed by the sculptor and the photographer about the sculptor and the parrot as being both instruments of mimicry, copying from life, and a magician perhaps in the case of Robert Adams and his dramatic welding workshop on the right. In the photographs of direct carving, it's invariably that special ideal moment that's recreated. This is to be noted especially in the photographs that are taken of Gordievrushka and Zabke, shown here. Sometimes, that should be said very rarely, this appears to be somehow rather authentic. At other times, and more often, staged and posed, reminding us again that the studio is a stage on which the sculptor can act out or demonstrate his or her work for the camera. Either way, there is a curious shared moment here, coordinated and captured by the photographer between sculpture and photography to be observed, in the timing of the pressing of the camera switch and with the hammering of the chisel. The idea of photography as the objective record of truth is undercut through such equivalency, and to be read similarly as a handheld, handcrafted fiction. These are just not only well-timed camera shots, but also moments of contrived implication between photographer and subject, which are again reenacted when the viewer first sets eyes on the photographs. Brancusi, who took his own studio photographs, was of course a particularly talented engineer of such contrivances. and from time to time superimposed one image upon another to create ghostly photographs of himself and his work in the studio. The resulting photographs are also often composite images, bearing traces of different studio moments. The sculptor, based in Paris, but whose French was not fluent, relied a lot on photography, both to enable his sculpture to be seen abroad and to explore and communicate his ideas about it. His studio here is reflected in the polished surface of his sculpture Nancy Cunard, a conceit to which the individual work stands through synecdoche for the whole of his oeuvre and for his studio. Moving from the individual work and artist to the more panoramic studio, we highlighted this next series of photographs an important shift in how the studio environment functioned. From being right at the heart of the studio view, the sculptor gradually disappears from sight. In some, as in Mark Vogue's photographs of Zadkine's studio, the sculptor becomes much harder to find. Whilst almost slipping out of the frame, this is nevertheless Zadkine's place, and his position at the bottom right-hand corner of this image, the spot where traditionally the artist's signature would be found, on a sheet of paper, drawn, or a canvas, subtly emphasises this authorship in relation to the place. Interestingly, these two photographs of Zadkine's studio were taken in 1914 and in 1923, almost 10 years apart, a striking example, I think, of the continuation of a visual strategy over time. The role of Mark Vogue, the photographer, is also important here, reminding us of the participatory role of the photographer in composing these images and in articulating the studio with and for the artist. But what happens when the sculptor disappears altogether? And what kind of place does the studio become? If there is a general shift in photographic format, discernible here, from the portrait format to the landscape format, we are still, I think, dealing with a kind of portraiture. Traces of sculpture endeavour, debris, tools, unfinished work, all provide testimony to work in progress, and all invest the images with a creative charge that is arguably even more potent in the sculptor's absence. In such photographs, the whole studio becomes a kind of sculpture or sculpture installation. Ensembles of objects and sculptures of different heights and different materials articulate a charged togetherness that is facilitated by the photographic frame. I'd like to show you a few of these. So this is Dobson's studio on the right, after being bombed during the Second World War, and Thornycroft's studio, a photograph that was taken just after his death, both vacated studios. Henry Moore's and Turnbull's, with a studio photograph taken 5 years after Brancusi's death. Paul Labe's photograph of Barbara Hepworth's studio in London on the left is a good example of the kind of sculptorless panoramic studio I'm talking about. To the right, we see a workbench and tools. On the left, a stone boulder on top of the modelling table. Whilst on the table in the middle, we're faced with a kind of studio still life, in which sculpture, tools, and a cup of tea all seem to share a set of object relations on the level. To the centre and in the background is the studio window and the garden beyond, a natural world which has already begun to encroach upon the studio environment. In Brancusi's studio view, taken from above on the right, we again find a kind of microcosmic world where stone, wood, and metal all take their place within a curious quasi-natural order. Many of these stone blocks are props, never to be carved into, and serve to display work and provide material and surface contrast to the sculptures positioned on display. The spaces within these ensembles are also brought into service and contribute towards the curious harmony of object-spatial relations he sought to achieve, and through which he explored the space of his studio as an environment for display. Sometimes, as in the case of Rodin, and here in the case of McWilliam, photographs are brought together, collage-like, to effect such installations through Panorama. In the case of the latter, two photographs of the same studio corner that William's purpose-built new modern studio home were placed together by the artist to create a new, surrealised space, an impossible studio which could only be encountered through photography. The idea of the sculptor's studio as an impossible place is one that runs through many of these photographs. The studios were currently staged as a place of transformation where art and life collapse into one another and new exchanges and relations can occur. One of the ideas contributing to this is that of the timelessness of the studio, a place not only without clocks, but also out of sync with modern life. This echoes nowhere more powerfully than in the studio photographs of Grasse, published in the Surrealist journal Minotaur in 1933. These photographs represent an extraordinary moment in the history of the studio photograph. The second larger room of the exhibition was based on this moment. In this room, a sculpture by each of the 6 artists who were included in Grasse's series were positioned in front of large, enlarged studio photographs in which these same works appear. Works by Brancusi, Despio, Giacometti, Laurent, Lipchitz and Meyer. In this room, the sculptor has disappeared altogether, and the gallery come studio visitor is faced with a totally different experience in front of a large-scale photographic version of a kind of imaginary composite studio. In this group of 6 studios, the female figures on display do not evoke the myth of the artist and model, Pygmalion and Galatea, but now stand as new and mysterious beings, sighted in the studio with their own animistic charge, whether drawn from classical mythology, totemic structures, or other topographical references. The gallery visitor was given the opportunity to compare materials, the original studio clay or plaster with a borrowed bronze, a chance to think about the play of different scales between the original and the copy, between the actual and the photograph, and a chance to walk around the sculpture that was depicted in the photograph, and thus through this to imagine walking into the studio within the gallery. We tried here in a sense to map the studio onto the gallery, but in a poetic rather than any archaeological or accurately reconstructive sense. What was once a small studio photograph on the page was enlarged to 2 to 3 meters. At the same time, these photographs by Grasse represent an extraordinary moment in the book itself. Reproduced over 12 pages, with a double-page spread per sculptor, the series of photographs offered the first prolonged visual engagement with the phenomenon of the sculptor's studio. In the exhibition, we tried to continue this. They're scaled up and presented as windows or doorways, thresholds into a way of experiencing the studio. The photographs and the works assembled aim to give viewers a sense of how the studio might be visually experienced, encountered and comprehended, both as a photograph, as sculpture, but also as an exhibition. Although the idea of the studio today is still articulated and widely understood through photography, our understanding of it has also been, to my mind, increasingly mediated by the phenomenon of the studio reconstruction. It's a compelling idea, since it provides a 3-dimensional, spatialized and installational account of the studio, and though it draws upon photography and film, it extends beyond them to provide a direct experience of its frame and its contents. Today, there are a growing number of studio reconstructions, but Brancusi's is arguably the most internationally known and has been since the late 1970s. It's a reconstruction with a complicated history, but in its most recent incarnation, namely the 1997 Renzo Piano reconstruction, we find a fascinating and wonderful reinvention of it. Now visitors cannot physically enter the studio, rather they look in from the outside through glass walls that frame the studio, providing it with a new openness, transparency and increased light levels, and of course a view that the artist himself never had. The ensembles of sculptures on display have been staged in very particular ways through an awareness of photography, of the photographer Brancusi himself took in his lifetime. Through this, each glass window affords photographically coordinated studio views, which the visitor looks at walking around this glass-walled studio. So I'm showing you a few here. This is the main room. As you walk around in the clockwise direction, switching the other way around, there's sitting room, seating area, into a room that's being coordinated around the idea of portraiture and various plates and sockets. Into the room that doubled up as both a workshop and as a sleeping area. His bed is up on the mezzanine. There is actually the last room, interestingly, is a room that Brancusi himself in his studio used as a junk room. It never had any coordinated display attached to it, but it's still in the Ponte Reconstruction there as a visible and viewable room. The issue of whiteness and Brancusi's new white cube presentation, inside and outside the glass-walled box, cannot be overlooked nor underestimated here. The whiteness of Brancusi's studio was one of the most notable aspects of his studio during his own lifetime, an aspect much described by his contemporaries, and one which has greatly contributed to the image of Brancusi's work. Brancusi's studio is not merely to be seen as a proto-white cube, but as an elaborate construct that was generated by the artist through his sculpture, through his own monochrome photography, through his artistic self-fashioning, and through the characterization of his studio by his supporters as a place to stage his art and his life. Indeed, earlier, studio photography problematizes the cliched idea of Brancusi's studio as a solitary, autonomous site of individual creative endeavour. Eight Amanshauser was not just a one-person workshop, it was also an intellectual property with a communal reach, a place where hospitality was offered, friendships formed, and ideas were shared. It was through his involvement with people like Man Ray, Tristan Tzara, Duchamp, Blaise Cendrars, Leger, Nina Loy, and many others, and other studio visitors in these early years, that crucial aspects of his white studio characterization were first collaboratively formulated and provided with its first conceptual commentary, from it being a place of snow, through being a place of the heavens and celestial activity. The complex art and lifestyle that the studio contained can still be tantalizingly glimpsed through an art historical examination of the archival documents and photographs. A 1921 photograph of Brancusi's white Samoy, called Polaire, can tell us a lot, for example, about the extent to which he developed whiteness as part of his artistic and studio identity. When Polaire died, Brancusi borrowed Edward Steichon's Samoy dog called Storm, pictured on the right, to accompany him and be seen with on his trip to the States in 1926. Not only did these photographs shed light on the extraordinary level of artistic self-fashioning at stake here, but they also remind us, I think, that Brancusi's studio whiteness had a conceptual mobility, and a transatlantic one at that. Such tantalizing imagery provides testimony to the complex meanings of the studio Brancusi lived and worked in. The studio was, of course, a social as well as an artistic place, a place of lives as well as views. For a number of contemporary artists, however, Brancusi's later reconstructed studio evidently serves as an instant example of how the studio might be seen, imagined, and experienced today. Artists such as Mike Nelson, Paul McCarthy, Urs Fischer, Richard Bendert, Jason Rhodes, Tobias Rayberg, and many others have all made work that quietly reflects a quiet and knowing awareness of the 1997 studio reconstruction. In this way, it is Brancusi's studio itself, as a mode of display and presentation, that has, since 1997, attracted many artists. Brancusi's reconstructed studio seems now to stand as a compelling case study, both as a proto-installation ensemble of artworks at the studio, but also as a post-installation curating of the studio as a work of art. It is a space without an artist, in which sculpture and placement can be engaged, set out on display in front of the visitor, but also out of reach. These characteristics coincide with contemporary practices that take the artist out of the picture, that try to make directed installations that privilege the experience of the gallery visitor, standing in front of the material environment presented. Such installations often share the same object display strategies employed in the Brancusi studio reconstruction, with its creative curating and inside-outside views that must accommodate visitors looking in from the outside. Some have been informed by the piano architecture, its vitrinous spaces, and by the box-within-a-box solution. Some by the installation, the strategies of display employed inside. All in all, a number of contemporary artists thus seem to be subtly engaging with the studio's museum-based incarnations as they stage their own studio installations, dress rehearsed back in the studio within the walls of the museum. Today, as we think about how the restaging of his studio has impacted upon contemporary responses to his work, it might perhaps be more urgent than ever to return to the photographic archive and keep in mind the kinds of earlier images, inventions, and in turn complex ideas about the studio that circulated during the lifetime of this artist. Thank you.
Katharina Grosse. She lives and works in Berlin. Since 2010, she's a professor at the Art Academy in Düsseldorf. And as I already told, she has this amazing artist's house built as her studio and as her living space, which is on which there's also publication, an amazing publication which you can buy outside or local. Some exhibitions, a selection in 2009. She had an exhibition at the temporary Kunsthalle in Berlin, Shadow Box. And at the same year, Standwick, Neues Museum Nürnberg, Hello Little Butterfly, I Love You, What's Your Name, Museum for Moderne Kunst Aachen, or in 2010, Katharina Grosse at the Quadriennale in Düsseldorf, and the same year, one floor up, Moabit, Mars Mocha, North Adams, USA, or 2011, Männer sollen Frauen wollen at the Galerie Barbara Gross, Munich, and in 7 days' time, permanent outdoor sculpture at the Kunstmuseum in Bonn, and she was and she was also she also participated in numerous group exhibitions. So 2002 at the Biennial in Sao Paulo, 2003 Deutsche Malerei 2003, and so on and so forth. Please welcome with me Katharina Grosse.
Good evening. Thanks for having me tonight and for this lovely introduction. And it's beautiful. I've never been to Salzburg, and to have the chance to talk to you about my thoughts on how I work and where I work. They have really made me think a little bit more about my praxis again. It was really fascinating to prepare these things. I've prepared a couple of images for you, showing both my house and also some of my work. Now, that's an interesting question, where do I work? But in the end, that's not how I start. I just do things in a sense. And when I looked through my archive, I found a couple of very early pieces where I thought also, excuse me, so which mic is actually a good mic? Is this also working? Yeah? Okay. So I was thinking, it's going to be a very short lecture tonight. I was thinking as a kid, all these things come so naturally to you, right? So when you, this is my first studio actually, it's my brother and me on a balcony of my parents' apartment in the south of Germany, and that's so interesting. We had chosen for our little collaboration, that was mostly what I did, collaborations when I was young. We had chosen exactly the little side that's in between inside and outside. So it was a balcony that was nevertheless sheltered, which we would call probably an outdoor room, and we were making a large painting of, it looks like penises in a sense, I guess, probably around Cy Twombly's most vital times, I guess. So, and if you look really closely, you can also see that actually who is doing the drawing is my brother, and I'm probably only giving some good remarks and consulting him, I guess. And then there is another little indication of my early artistic activity, and that was so funny because I got it from my mom. Also, this photograph was kept by my parents, and this is a very early piece, an Easter egg. And I chose it because most of you might be familiar with that technique and also with that practice. But in that case, I was really intrigued by it again because my mom turned up like 5-6 years ago and said, look what I've kept. And I think it is so close to what you're doing now. So I thought, wow, she's actually right. And also I love the egg, but also when you look at it, how it is actually, what kind of structure it offers to you, it does have to do a lot with what I'm thinking about sculptural support, and also my way to use things as a support and change them through that activity of painting. So here, for example, you have a more dimensional surface that has no beginning and no end. Yeah, that is in a sense infinite. And here on this photograph it might look very large, but as you envision yourself having it in your hand, and you can see fingerprints on that photograph, like here for example, if you turn it around, and in that moment the egg turns small and it will turn very big. So there's a dramatic scale shift happening according to which media you have to actually bring you that work closer. And the moment you turn it in your hand, you actually cover what you see. That is also something that is very, very intrinsically connected to the way I work. When you walk into one of those more dimensional paintings in space, you actually cover either the floor or you're in your own way when looking at something. Another thing that is very important in this little piece, and what I still find very intriguing in working with more dimensional spaces in painting, is that there is no one way to look at the work. There's no one right pivotal point from which you can see all, or from where the work makes most sense. It is always little snippets that you get from the whole, and then you put it together in your mind, remembering what you've already seen. Another thing which happens here too is that by painting or making a drawing on that egg, the egg changes from its function of containing food into a pictorial space. So you have some sort of overlapping happening of a functional item with abstract sort of spatial thinking, which means that you have a coincidence of something you can measure and name, like an egg this much, maybe 7 centimeters. So you have a coincidence of a materialized structure with rules and a pictorial structure that has totally different spatial rules than a measured object has. And the coincidence of two systems that seem in many ways to contradict one another is a paradox that's very different to bear when you look at it, and very rarely to experience in normal life. And that is one of the main issues that I'm fascinated by when painting meets more dimensional surfaces. Sometimes you wonder when you have these moments in your studio, why do I do the work? Why is there still, this feeling of not really knowing what you're doing, even though you're doing it all the time and you're asking them these questions all the time. And then sometimes these things come up all of a sudden somewhere from another world, in a sense, that give you really fantastic explanations. And I had such a moment a little while ago when I was preparing a show in it was in Cincinnati in the United States, and I had a little moment to go to the museum, which was a big private collection, actually housing a lot of different areas, like Tiffany glass, but also European painting from the 18th to the contemporary times, and also beautiful old Greek sculptures, etc. So it was a real old kind of beautiful beautiful museum, and I saw when going to the entry to the ticket box, I saw a little guy with his family coming towards the entrance, and he was wearing yellow boots, black trousers, a yellow shirt, and a black hat. So he looked so specific, you know, from far away. I thought, wow, that's... And I wanted to, he stayed in my mind, and then I went downstairs to the toilets, and all of a sudden, you know, the American toilets have these, only these little panels that separate booths from booths. So all of a sudden, the booth next to me, there I heard a sound, and there was a little yellow boot poking through into my booth, you know. And that yellow boot had actually a drawing on it that was like this. So that was the second, you know, encounter with this guy. And then I forgot about it. I thought, oh, I should maybe take a photo, but then it went too fast, and I started to look at different sections of the museum, and I could not get this little guy out of my head. And I was wondering, why is he so much more fascinating than the beautiful Poussin painting I was looking at, or the old master from Renaissance times. I was really looking forward to seeing at that time, you know. So I actually went and looked for the little boy, and I took this photo. And then later, when I was doing my work in Cincinnati, I started to understand why this was so important to me, because it was so closely connected to what I'm interested in. As well with the egg, you know, here we have such a dramatic transformation. We have such a dramatic transformation from ball pen, with a ball pen, a little drawing on a rubber boot, and that a gum boot is actually meant to be protecting your feet, but right away it changes into a pictorial surface with a yellow substance. That's what I found very fascinating. The other question I asked myself, did the little kid do it on purpose? Did he know that did he actually make the drawing? Who made the drawing? Did a person bigger than him make the drawing on his foot? When the boot was on his foot, or did he make the drawing himself, like scratching his skin? So what was the scale relationship of the drawing to the boot, to the larger context, which is the kid, to the even bigger context, which in that sense was the museum? Something else I really loved was that he was carrying that little drawing through the whole museum to the various different times and epochs of art making or thinking and materializing thought. So, these were little indicators of other areas in a sense, but nevertheless very close to what I'm thinking, and that always come back to me as reminders of what kind of interests I do my work based on. When I was early on studying art, I did not have a studio. I was working in the school, and I started to dislike being in a box or in an institutional surrounding. So I decided to go outside, and I started to do landscape painting, and that had that fascinated me a lot. That's actually how I got to painting. I started to paint trees and things I saw outside in the countryside, and I like the space. I like that landscape opens up your peripheral thinking, and so I started to be really fascinated, not only for that reason, but also for that reason I started to be fascinated by Edvard Munch, and also his studio practice is something that still stays with me. Here we see Munch in the studio, which is an outdoor place. So he had different modes of working, but one very specific thing he created for himself was the idea that the painting has to be taken outside of the studio, into the snow, into the surrounding, into the influence of weather and sunlight, and there the painting would change and be maybe manipulated, modified, inspired, and then he would take it back inside and stretch it on canvas. Sometimes he would also bring stretch canvases outside. And he stuck to this practice quite long, until there are also photos of him as an old man, with white hair, standing outside in like this high grass in between plants and paintings and canvases on the floor. And I found this was such a freedom-loving thought to be outside, to treat the paintings not only in the in an academic, let's say, way that tells you how to do, what to do, when to do it, and so the result would be technically be fantastic. But here you have an artist actually sabotaging the idea of technically maintaining the work as well as possible. And through all these ways of traveling and looking at the outside and the inside, I started to develop my work a lot on the walls of institutions and wherever I was invited. So there was this moment of like 5 or 6 years where I was maybe only 3 days at home, and most of the time I was doing work outside somewhere else, sometimes outside of buildings, inside, in different situations. It started very, very slowly. I will come to that later, but there was a moment when I thought that traveling was being too difficult, too much, too little concentration was happening in my understanding of what my studio practice actually was, because it did exist. I always had a studio alongside this travel activity. So I had old storages, I had old factory buildings where I would work. I would sometimes work in very big spaces, and I always loved the idea of the outdoor feel inside a house. So I thought if I'd ever have a studio, I should have a studio that would feel outdoorsy inside. And another thing that I started to dislike about my factory studios, or my storage studios, or sometimes a gas station I would have, I disliked about those that they were always made for another purpose but what I thought my painting needed. So I always had to adapt or to reconstruct the indoors situation to make it work for me. Very often the light was not very good, very often there was no heating, and I thought it was not good and unfair that an artist would not have the same specialized condition as a gas station would provide for the mechanic, or a hairdresser salon would provide for the hairdresser. So I thought an artist should not disappear somewhere in an old discarded building. An artist should be also visible with his building in the society, in the social context, in the middle of the city. So that's when I started to understand that when I was starting to live in Berlin from 2000 on, I thought, okay, I'm not going to look for an old building, but maybe I'll have something built for what I thought should the studio look like from the outside, but also should provide the minimum difference from indoor and outdoor life. So I started to make a little, to write it all down, what I needed. I wrote like 3 or 4 pages on my needs, on my necessities, and I turned up at like 5 different offices of architects in Berlin, and I had them make proposals. And it actually started with a wish. You can see here a little book that I published later on when the building was built, to thank the architects, which did a fantastic job. And I decided to work with somebody that is called Augustinundfrank. There are it's a couple, a man and a woman, and they built the studio here. And what I loved about their way of thinking and working was that they didn't try to invent an image that looks like a studio. They didn't try to do their signature architectural design that could then be on a glossy cover of a magazine, which is all right with me on the other hand, but they were so carefully working alongside the notes that I had made. That was really amazing. And another decision that I had made after giving them my notes was that I would leave it to them. I would not interfere and not discuss every 2 weeks the design. So it was actually not earlier than like 6 months later that I came to the building site. And what you can see here is like a very simple situation. You have a concrete cast skin that is housing the studio, 2 studio spaces on the upper floor. So there's 2 floors. The floor is from here, that's the top floor with skylight, so that's the two studios. And then you have two smaller inserts, mezzanines, where here's the living area and that's the office, and in between those two is a storage. So my wish was that I could enter the house and be by myself without realizing that other people would possibly work for me or work in the office and so on. The concrete skin is, that was the first thing that was cast, so that was like a big box somehow. You can also see the wooden structure really very clearly, as if you would cast from some orange box that you find on the market. That's exactly how it looks. That's the only skin that you have. So the skin is here, and the other side of this wall is directly where I work on. So there's nothing around it that somehow makes the studio be mantled or thickly closed in a dome. So you enter and you're right away in there, and you paint on the walls that are actually the outside of the building. That's the front view. You see here a little entry for the office section. And there is like the door to the storage. In between those, there is no corridors or no really closed spaces. I didn't want to have rooms that can be separated from one to the other. You have one staircase going up here, go in here, go out into the office, you go further up to the studio, go through here. Here is another staircase going into the sleeping room and the bathroom, and one further down going to the kitchen and the library. And then you would go through a door again in the storage. I show you that a little bit in some photographs. Here you see another detail from, here is where the library is, some moving boxes in there. That was a very early photograph. And the kitchen is here, and you see a little detail. The house is kind of snugged into onto the existing wall, so there's a little spare space where they made the house fit and deal with the fact that the walls were listed. So we were not allowed to break into the walls or make doors or anything. One little thing is that since I have skylight everywhere, I wanted one little space where I could go outside and look and have fresh air. So here's some sort of very tiny balcony or pergola, like a balcony thing, yeah, where I can actually be outside, have lunch, or sit and read. Alright, so here's the book. I took some photos of the book, so some of you that are interested in spatial planning, I took this to show you really quickly. Here you have the section of the house with the mezzanine level and the studio level, which is like secting here where the two windows are. Here sleeping room and kitchen and library, and here you see it from above. Storage, toilets, offices, and again toilets, kitchen, and the library. So the idea was that I could do anything I liked whenever I wanted it, and I had no travel in the city to reach my workplace. Here you see is a big hole in the floor, so there was the problem of the elevator was solved by just having a crane that allows me to bring larger things in and out. When I actually started to live in the studio, here's the entrance, I realized it was too small. It is not a small studio, but I had this idea that it should be in the center of the city and be of reasonable size, so that I can, when I go bigger, rent something in addition, and when I have to shrink, I can do that again and still have a very comfortable, very clear space. And I did rent something for the sculptural work very soon that is only 10 minutes away from there. An interesting little detail is that here the skin of the house with the window cut into here does not coincide with actually the floor separation. So you see the window goes lower, even though the floor is up here. So when you see the house from the outside, you can't really know what the windows refer to, which is an interesting idea. Then you go upstairs, and halfway upstairs you come to the office, which I need to do all my publicational work, travel planning. I have my own archive, which is dialogue and digital, which is digital and analog, and I meet people here. I have the chance of meeting people without letting them into the studio, where I can still decide whether I like to go onto the studio or not, and also We decided to have really large windows. That's another feature here, because Berlin tends to be very dark and kind of grey in winter time. And so even though you have maybe rain or moody seasons, you still feel so like outdoors and connected to the outdoors that you can see whatever goes on during the day. Another thing is that when you're sitting in the house and it's lit at night, you're kind of exposed. So the house changes totally the way it's seen and the way the functions are displayed from day to night. And I kind of like that as well, that this is then like a little bit like a neon ad in a sense, and you're totally visible and connected as you can see what's going outside. You can see what's going inside, on the inside. And I also like the fact that you can look through the house. So even though this big monolithic concrete structure that you saw at the beginning, it has these piercings where actually there are voids that are shooting through, and you can see the supermarket behind the house even though you're quite far away from it. Here again the staircase that leads us up to one of these entries to the studio, and that's then one of the studio spaces just before I moved in. Very simple, just grey floors, which I covered with some protection paper. And this is after a little while how it looked from above. Here, people working, rolling things in. And here you have, for example, the smaller studio space of the two, where you have a table where I'm working on different things I was preparing at that time. That photo is a little bit older, it's about 2008 I think it was taken. So here you have a space in a model. That's the Aachen Museum in Denmark, where I was preparing a large show. And here you have the Kunsthalle show that was just mentioned, with 4 very large warped forms inside. So you have all sorts of scales happening in the studio. But what I'm not doing at all is wall painting in the studio. So there are totally different things being done, organized, thought through, and understood in the studio than I have time, and also I have the wish to do outside. Here again, a more recent photograph on things I'm working on. Again, you have the synchronicity of paintings I'm doing directly on the wall without stretchers that can be easily rolled together and put away if I don't work on them again, and maybe I take them up half a year later. Or you have models here with sculptural forms that I cut into styrofoam that are being discussed and taken up again later on to plan shows. A fascinating situation is that when you are in the studio itself, you do not connect it to the other functions of the house. So this idea that I can step downstairs to a sleeping room, for example, is not at all appearing to me when I'm working in that more or less industrial-looking studio space. There is right away, once you come into that cardboardy box, in a sense, there is this idea that you're by yourself, but you can still hear the sounds of the outside. You hear the street, you hear birds, you hear things happening outside. So this kind of idea that you have the minimum skin that separates you from that volume, that's the outside, and the inside volume, that's quite a thing that can be bodily experienced in that studio space. I was not aware of that so much when we were planning the studio, that this is what actually happens, that I'm actually working on the inside skin, and that is directly if I would poke through the wall at the outside. And once I lived in Marfa and had a residency at the Judd Foundation, and I was so fascinated by this old military barracks that had no entry zone, that was ceremonial in a sense. You would open the door, you were in, you would open the door, you'd be out in the desert. And you had only that very little thin protection skin between in and out. And I'm really happy that this also works in that space as well. So once you go downstairs, you come then to the space where I sleep. So that has pink floors and pink, like apricot colorish wardrobes. I had no furniture and nothing. The only thing I owned was a bed. and so I had to have everything built in, and also curtains I bought for that situation, which I really like because they look a little bit like a theater curtain that's opening every morning, where then the show kind of starts. And the curtain also would change the acoustics in the space, which was interesting. So it was a little bit like upholstery, just used in a different way. And some books in the bathroom, and then you'd go downstairs to a little kitchen, and you'd have another space with a sofa where I could read, and also I would have a door that would lead me outside. So I could actually enter the space without my team knowing me to be in. So it's a certain privacy there. In the storage. So I do store quite a lot of work, unfinished stuff, my own collection, and also the assistants have a space where they work and prepare things. And then we come to why do I do this? Because I can work there as well. So why the heck do I come up with a studio, and why do I have the need for such an apparatus that makes my work easy and smooth? And so I thought I would give you some little abstract on how I started out with getting a new idea of how a painter could use the spaces painting is shown in. So I had this show in Bern, in Kunsthalle in Switzerland in '98, and they said I could do whatever I liked, and I walked into the space, looked up in the corner, and thought, wow, that's actually where I wanted to have the painting sitting. So my gaze was finding the space in the exhibition hall. So I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. Why do painters always make only use of the size of the walls? Why don't they shouldn't they have a different way to use the exhibition space than a sculptor has? And that's when I started to think of another way to place and locate the colored field or the pictorial field. So I didn't touch the wall anymore with a paintbrush, which would locate and connect me very intensely with the given surface, but I would use a spray gun that kind of created a distance, and I could look at what I was doing at the same time. So this combination of looking at it and doing it at the same time was so connected to the movement of my eyes, and not so much connected anymore to the movement of my hand or arm, rather the body. Another thing that I started to realize, and that I did not pre-conceptualize, but as I just told you when I was talking about the egg, was that the coincidence of the pictorial space, which is unfathomable, not measurable, in a certain sense illusionistic, and the coincidence with these rules and the built space that had totally different parameters to come into existence, which means a totally different materialization, and also the vectorial organization of three different directions in space. This coincidence is so paradox and so difficult to understand that I thought it was amazing that painting allows for the coincidence of these very difficult to coincide issues. And I think that is one of the things that make painting so vitally acute for me these days, that painting gives you the opportunity to coincide things that actually exclude one another, which I think has an amazing anarchic potential. So the fact that I've come here, taking a train, taking an airplane, walking, now standing here, you can only see my body from all these actions. In painting, that's totally different. In painting, you can see what you did like 2 days ago and do now. You can see it all at the same time. It's all there. You can even look at it in a reversed way. So you can think that maybe the thing you look at now is the one that is the latest move, and that's the earliest move. So you can actually deconstruct ideas like future, present, and past. You can develop a totally different idea of negotiating multiple spaces. And that's what I started to understand with this very simple incident of just one color in a little corner. And from there out, my thoughts started. I started to understand after this piece in Marfa, for example, I did it a little later. I started to understand that I'm actually not painting the walls, I'm painting the inside of an object. I'm painting the inside of a body, which is in that case a house. Sometimes also activities would happen that would only be like priming, for example. So this is a little antique city in the Netherlands, in Leeuwarden, and they asked me to participate in a larger project of many artists doing something in their city, and they were so concerned about that it would be dangerous if I paint on their walls, that other people would then start putting graffiti everywhere. So I said, okay, then I do something very simple, only white. It has not a relationship to tagging or graffiti. And then I made this painting, it's called This Is No Dog Shit. And the audience and also the people that lived in the city said after 2 weeks I should take it down, it would be an insult, it was not painting, it wasn't finished. You know, so this is an interesting situation where you negotiate meanings beforehand. And the overlapping of different functions, as I said in the beginning, gave me sometimes possibilities to understand painting in various ways. For example, this is a stable up in the mountains in the Swiss Alps, and I wasn't allowed to, that was conditioning my work of course, it wasn't allowed to paint directly onto the walls, and that is one of the rare incidences where I constructed out of cardboard a minimal surface that is like an insert into the stable iconography. When seeing these things like the stable or the surrounding that is functionally so connected to certain uses, I started to understand that I could also use things that were less spectacular. I mean, the stable up in the Alps, so I thought, okay, maybe a bookshelf. And I did this little piece in a place in Karlsruhe at a private gallery, which made me understand that the appearance of the object, that is the support of the painting and the painting at the same time, can't be separate. So if I take the object away, the painting is gone. If I take the painting away, the context is gone. So I started to understand that this is quite an interesting symbiosis. And also the fact that the orange, for example, goes from the wall onto the shelf. It kind of breaks up the object's contours and the object's borders. So I could actually break hierarchic situations with painting as well. Here in the relationship with the window is a picture maker in a sense too. So I just wanted to give you some of the little things that inspired my ongoing thought. And here I have some very interesting photograph. I was once on a design congress with people asking artists and totally different people, when is a work finished? And there was somebody invited, his name is Walter von Lucadou, and he is an expert on paranormal phenomena. And when he saw me talk about my work, he said, wow, that's so amazing. That's exactly the way that people talk about when they have a ghost in their house. So sometimes he gets these photographs, like here, from people who says, you know, my house is haunted. I came home and all of a sudden the shelf was tipped over, you know. And he gets all sorts of interesting stories. And that was so fascinating to me because a lot of the things that he said about these phenomena would totally apply on my experience. So I was starting to wonder whether I was a ghost or, you know, in a sense, because I don't, maybe we can talk about it later, but I just wanted to say that these are things, that was actually one of the images I showed at that Congress. And that was the moment where I started to have a different thought about my work. I had 2 apartments in Berlin and in Düsseldorf, and I decided, also being fed up with a lot of the organizational work that I did and the size of the wall paintings I thought was getting out of hand, and I longed for doing something private, without deadline, without exhibition date, without exhibition function, and I came back to my Düsseldorf apartment and painted my bedroom. And that was an amazing experience, because all of a sudden a lot of things came into play that I had all before that decided to not want in the work at all, like narrative structures, like objects that can be named, like intimacy, like sexuality, like private, for example. And I made and also this idea of, do I lose something? So that was the only thing I really had. It was my bed, and it was a Jasper Morrison bed, and I was so very much in love with that bed, but then painting on it, would I maybe destroy it? Would I lose it? Would I lose value, for example? And once painting, all these thoughts totally disappeared, and I made the most interesting discovery of how the painted pictorial field would merge and, for example, in a show in Stockholm in magazine 3, where I had the bed and books and also clothes, and here I would also show large canvases, like large paintings that you would maybe have in your space at home as well. And the bookshelf also got into a major size on another show, like for example here we have a huge space that was just a new wing of a museum in Denmark, the Kleiderfabrik. They put a new floor on top of their already existing floor, so what am I actually walking on? What is the site? Is it the museum? Is it the new wooden floor? Or is the painting actually the location that I step onto? Where does the fiction of the work start and where does it stop? Or how does it coincide? All these things got then more expanded in the installational works I was invited to do. Also I brought, that was a novelty for me at that time, large paintings from the studio that were already finished. I put them equally into the show and painted them over as well. And when these items like books or countable things were getting a little bit like predictable to myself, I started to use soil, some mass that could be made bigger, larger, smaller. It also was very ambiguous in relationship to where it would appear. So here I used a huge mountain of soil in Taipei, where in the entry of the museum already existed benches and a little phone booth here, so it was a little bit like an indoor-outdoor space, like a piazza where people would meet and read and wait for others. Here even you have a person with a little booklet wondering where the next street maybe is, so this interference of the activity of the pulse from inside and the outside and the whole show that already existed, this stream, and I understand my work as just getting into the stream and kind of putting something to float. Sometimes also some only residue would be indicators of missing objects. So on the floor you have some contours coming, or like this is only leftovers of things that were there and I removed. So I started to actively paint over things and take the things away. So I started to be more and more interested in things that are there and that are not there, that are both making up the show. And the activity got more and more studio-like in a sense. So I would go from room to room and shift things around, exactly how I would work in the studio. So there is no residue or nothing that's really discarded, but the discarded object gets taken into the next space and used. Like for example here, a little bit of the soil comes through here again, and then these huge round shapes that are voids are actually canvases that are used in another space in the same museum to have the work travel and reveal and inverse the spatial qualities I was dealing with. And this idea of the inversion, of the turning around of plasticity and flatness and also descriptive landscapiness in a sense, got to a real condensed show in Masmoka in close to New York that I did in 2010, I believe. That was up for quite a while. That was a huge format, so I used these big soil things. I did wall paintings, floor paintings, but also created these huge styrofoam things that were cut out in the space and piled on the painted stuff as if crystallized light would travel through the space. And that whole space was like, for like 2 months, was my workplace on the occasion. Dealing with these masses and these big things difficult to move, I started to wonder whether the painted surface could also float, could just be moved from into the volume, for example. And after a couple of different smaller works, I came up with this thing last year. It's a big, let's say, broken off piece of a larger context with a painting that is far vaster than the surface that's been generated by the sculptural object. It's also painted from behind. The diagonal is about like 18 meters long, and it is sitting at the outside of the museum in Bonn. Back again to this year, maybe just one more thing that I would like to show you. It's the show I did for Johann König, and his gallery is already put into another space that is not a gallery space. So it was a former factory, and he put like an inserted, with a little bit of a notion of a ceiling relic up here. He put an inserted structure into the space that then allowed me to insert another layer of the home setting with a sofa that indicates the ideas of classic modernism. It's a Florence Knoll sofa, and two large sculptures that are then generating a totally different scale and organic form system. And I also painted voids into that existing ensemble then, like huge voids here where the gallery floor, the carpet and the object have different notions and grades of reality in relationship to the place that you walk through. And one other thing that I did at the end of, after Johann Königs, like a little while ago, I did here in Vara in the train station of this little town. They had nothing but that house, and they wanted to have something that would make it look remarkable and also would prevent people to leave the community, because since a little while they had a huge drain of people going to Göteborg and leaving that little tiny country place, and they had thought of doing something amazing, and they built a concert hall. And this concert hall is booked out every night. There are 500 seats, and people come from all over the country, and they go and listen to music and to theater and cabaret and everything. And they started to think, wow, so culture can change that. The next step then was to apply for a beautifying plan for their train station. That was this little house, and we decided to actually, so the house was already there. The house was giving the whole setup, and the only thing I could think of using the house as an outdoor structure to make my work pop up and be bigger than it actually is in that surrounding. And we painted the house and glazed the tiles of the roof and then put these things on top. See the relationship, it looks different from all sides. It has like a totally insert, cut in blue box kind of reality to the surrounding functions of the city, which is the station, the mayor, the concert hall and so on, which is all invisible relationship to it. Yeah, that's about how far I would go now, and